This is the podcast for the journal Neuropsychopharmacology. I'm Cynthia Graber. Scientists have been amassing an increasing amount of evidence about the impact of racial discrimination and racial trauma, including how it can have an impact on brain regions involved with threat vigilance and emotional regulation. At the same time, there's evidence that increased engagement in those areas has been linked to increased risk of mental health problems like depression, and they also suspect it could be a vulnerability for brain health issues such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
And a question that's come up in our lab is, so there's a relationship between racial trauma and activation in these threat vigilance and emotion regulation areas, but what could be kind of a biological mechanism that is underlying this brain change?
Negar Fani is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Emory University School of Medicine, and she worked with Aziz Elbasheir, a PhD candidate at Emory University in the neuroscience program, on the study. They knew that C-reactive proteins, or CRPs, are a marker of immune activation in the blood.
So C-reactive protein is an acute phase protein that's been associated with systemic inflammation. And not only is it a marker of systemic inflammation, but it's been a marker that's been commonly associated with various mental clinical outcomes, such as PTSD, major depressive disorder, and anxiety.
So to do the study, you worked with participants in the Grady Trauma Project and focused on Black women. This is the longest-running study of trauma, and the people who participated aren't necessarily psychiatric patients. They were just coming in for primary care appointments or accompanying someone. What did you do?
We recruited them as part of the study and asked them questions about their trauma exposure and other things like post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And then some people went on to different arms of the study, including our imaging arm. And in this imaging arm of the study, we administered tasks, including tasks that involved having to regulate your emotions while doing something that demanded attention. In particular, we gave our participants something called the affective Stroop task. And this task involves having to press a button that corresponds with the number of numbers you see on a screen. And the number of numbers could be the same as the number that's presented, or it could be different. And that sort of poses a higher attentional demand. And before people see the numbers and right afterwards, they're given an image. And that image could be threat-related or trauma-related. It could be neutral or it could be positive. And we wanted to see how seeing these images affected people's performance and affected brain activity as they were doing the task.
What types of images would be considered threat-related or trauma-related?
Yeah, so the threat-relevant images are images that pertain to some of the the most common types of trauma that our population have experienced. So they would see images like gun violence or interpersonal violence versus positive images where it would be someone celebrating a victory, and then you have neutral images of a book, for example. And so those are the three different type of stimuli that were part of the affective Stroop test.
So you asked people about whether they experienced discrimination, where, when, and how, and you tallied that up, and you measured CRP in the blood and looked at brain activation as part of this attention task. So what did you find?
We did a moderation analysis, and first we saw that greater experiences of racial discrimination were associated with greater activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex during attention to threat. And we used CRP levels as a moderating variable. And we saw that for the highest levels of CRP, that moderated the relationship between experiences of racial discrimination and ventromedial prefrontal cortex activation during attention to threat. But the intermediate levels and lower levels of CRP didn't moderate this relationship. So our findings show that at the highest levels of CRP, this relationship between racial discrimination and ventromedial prefrontal cortex activation was strengthened.
So what that means is that at lower levels of inflammation, we didn't see any relationship between discrimination and activation. But when we looked at people who had high levels of inflammation, that's when we saw a positive association between experiences of discrimination and activation in these brain areas. So only when people had high levels of inflammation measured through CRP did we see a positive association between experiences of discrimination and higher activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, as you mentioned, is linked to threat response and emotional regulation, and perhaps to outcomes such as depression and anxiety and even Alzheimer's. In general, what is this connection you saw telling you?
So it seems that maybe people who have experienced more of these discriminatory events sort of have to regulate, tamp down their emotions in response to something that's emotionally evocative, like a trauma-related image. And maybe this can be very adaptive because it helps people get through difficult situations, including encounters with people who are making maybe not necessarily the most overt racist response or just saying something that could be like a microaggression. But it's very adaptive for people to regulate themselves and not express anger or have any kind of impulsive or outward expression of anger, that kind of reaction. So it helps you get through the moment and get through your day and keep you from losing relationships and losing your job. But it takes a lot of energy. And that's something that we think about a lot is like, if this area is lighting up all the time in response to all different kinds of emotionally salient cues in our environment, what is that doing to the brain over time? And can it be sort of too much energy expenditure and not enough sort of rest, restoration, recuperation, and maybe promoting weathering of the brain down the line?
Where could this lead in terms of research?
For me, this being amongst the first studies to actually provide a biological mechanism for the associations between discrimination and activation in the brain, I think this can be the springboard to look at more biological mechanisms, even beyond inflammation. There could be others. There's other different type of markers that you can look at, for example, like DNA methylation and epigenetic markers that have also been associated with racial discrimination, as well as changes within these threat, network, and emotion regulation regions.
And how about in terms of clinical care? If you see that it's only people with a higher level of this particular inflammation marker that have that type of activation in the brain, could there be a way to reduce that inflammation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see inflammation as an additional marker of increased risk for these neurodegenerative problems. Like, I think once you have a good screening tool that looks at both biological mechanisms and self-reported environmental mechanisms, then you can have a profile emerge to say, like, look, this person is at high risk for things like, cardiometabolic problems and things that set the stage for later major health problems like stroke, heart attacks, and neurodegenerative disease. I think in the clinics, we can do an easy job of saying, just asking people about their experiences, getting some blood, looking at levels of inflammation, and then classifying someone as higher risk for these problems. It's not that hard.
I know there are a number of limitations. This is a relatively small study, and it only includes one particular group, Black women. But in general, what do you hope your colleagues walk away with after reading this paper? I
would hope is that just understanding at a more neurobiological level the effects of these environmental stressors that Black and brown people are disproportionately exposed to, and that racial discrimination is not just a moral issue that is in our society, but it's also a health condition, and it's something that has pervasive impact on the risk that Black and brown individuals have in relation to the development of a lot of different disorders and clinical outcomes. And so just providing an additional light and a level of seriousness to the effects of these environmental stressors like discrimination that can have on the people that are suffering and experiencing these type of events.
Dr. Fani?
I think seeing this as a real threat to the health of Black individuals in a way that, we're able to see more with our neuroimaging research, but I think people have known for a long time that this is something that has a profound effect on their lives. But I think just validating the fact that this is a major stressor, because I think it hasn't historically been. I think there's been a lot of skepticism around racism. Are we living in a post-racist society? And clearly we are not, if this is what people continue to report.
And that shows up in their brains.
Precisely. And something, to note is that we control for other factors that could produce this brain response. So we control for trauma exposure that's not racial trauma. We control for other factors that could lead to inflammation like age. So when we account for the variance associated with those other factors, we still see this robust effect of discrimination. So it is something unique to this type of stressor.
This is the podcast for the journal Neuropsychopharmacology. To read the paper discussed in the podcast, go to www.nature.com/NPP. I'm Cynthia Graber.